Welcome to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and it is a privilege to be your host tonight. Here at Standing for Truth, we uphold the authority of Scripture from the very first verse and examine the scientific evidence that confirms biblical creation and challenges the claims of deep time and evolution. Tonight, we're joined by a very special guest, Dr. J.L. Wile, a nuclear chemist who will walk us through powerful scientific evidence supporting a young Earth and exposing serious problems with the billions of years narrative. From extrapolation assumptions and planetary magnetic fields to soft tissue and fossils in carbon-14 found where it shouldn't exist, this is a data-driven presentation that you definitely don't want to miss. Dr. J, it's great to have you, brother. Welcome to Standing for Truth.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. How's your 2026 going so far? Keeping busy?
Yeah, well, keeping cold.
I hear you.
Yeah, it was negative 20 C here last night. So,
well, you're staying positive, brother. Yeah. I feel your pain. I'm in Ontario, Canada. It's been rough.
Yeah,
it's been rough here. But hopefully we can make people's days just a little bit better if it's cold for them with an excellent presentation here, Dr. J. And so for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are, as it is your first time here on Standing for Truth, I do want to give you a formal introduction. And so Dr. J.L. Wile is a nuclear chemist, educator, and author with a PhD in nuclear chemistry from the University of Rochester. He has conducted research funded by the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, and has published more than 30 peer-reviewed scientific papers. Dr. Wile is widely known in the homeschool community as the author of the Exploring Creation with Science series and the founder of Berean Builders Publishing, where he develops rigorous, Christ-centered science curricula used by thousands of families worldwide. He is a respected speaker and teacher dedicated to making science accessible while defending a biblical worldview. Amen, brother. In other words, you're more than qualified to be speaking on today's topic. Again, title of the talk, Why a Nuclear Chemist Rejects Billions of Years. Before I hand it to you, we can start getting ready to pull up your slides and presentation, Dr. J. But I do want to let the audience know, everybody that's live in our chat, what we are going to be doing format-wise for today's program is Dr. J will be giving a comprehensive talk that I'm very excited for you guys to see. You guys are going to see exactly why it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. Then we're going to jump into some questions and discussions on the topic. So please, if you got a question or even an objection to anything that Dr. J says during his talk, tag me at Donny or at Standing for Truth. That way I don't miss him. And we'll have some fun interacting with your comments. Dr. J, I'm looking forward to this. I've got your slides up right now. And the floor is yours, brother. Take as much time as you need.
Oh, very good. Thank you. So it's great to be here. This is a talk I'm very fond of giving. Specifically why I, as a scientist, as a nuclear chemist, believe in a young Earth. And I have to start off with a bit of a confession. When I went to graduate school, started studying nuclear chemistry, I was content with the idea of an old Earth. I didn't really care. I was a young Christian and, not very mature in my faith. All of my professors at university, my PhD advisor, all the folks I worked with at the nuclear chemistry lab, they all thought the Earth was old. And so, I was happy to believe that with them. However, I was always a little skeptical because as a chemist, one of the things you learn early on is there's difficulty in analyzing large sets of data. And as a chemist, you have to be very concerned about how you approach a large set of data. So let's just take an example. Suppose I take two hydrogen atoms, and they're separated fairly far apart right now. One's here and one's there. And I measure the potential energy of their interaction. And at first, I don't get any potential energy, so I move them a little close together. I still don't get any potential energy. Move them a little close together. I still don't get any potential energy. Now, I could be lazy, and I could stop there, and I could say, okay, it really doesn't matter. As far as I put them together, there's never going to be any potential energy. Well, that turns out to be wrong, because if I extend the data set a little bit, I'll find that as I get them closer and closer together, at first there's no potential energy, but then we start getting some negative potential energy. And negative potential energy simply means they're bound together now. And so now I've got lots of data points, and all these data points are showing me that the closer the hydrogen atoms get together, the lower the potential energy, the more bound they become. Now, there's a lot of data points there, and there's a clear pattern developing. So I could simply say, it must go on like that forever. And so the closer I get these hydrogen atoms, the lower the potential energy gets, all the way to almost zero separation. But once again, even though there's lots of data points there, I'd be wrong. Because if I keep measuring the potential energy, I find that it reaches a minimum. And then the potential energy goes up like crazy. And so as I push the hydrogens together, initially the potential energy goes down. I get to a point where they're close enough together, they get the minimum potential energy. And then if I try and push them closer together, that's going to increase the potential energy a lot. So the actual performance of the data is quite different from either of the first two trends that I thought existed. And it turns out, if you know chemistry, you know this is actually what determines the radius of a hydrogen molecule. The place where the two hydrogen atoms are lowest in potential energy is where they're going to, on average, sit as they share electrons and make a hydrogen molecule. And we call that the ground state radius. But nevertheless, nature throws these things at you. It throws you data that looks like it's on a particular trend. And if you're not careful, you can miss when that trend changes. And a careful scientist has to make sure any trend he or she is looking for is actually represented by the data and not something that I'm just assuming. Now, this is called extrapolation.
Dr. J?
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I was wondering, at the bottom, you see that little bar where it says hide? If you click just the hide, not the stop sharing.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
okay.
Perfect. Because then we can see the entirety of the slide.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. We're good, Dr. J.
Okay, very good. When scientists do that, they take a range of data and they infer what happens beyond that range. That's extrapolation. So the first two times when I did that, I took those 3 points and said, oh, there must be no potential energy. Or I did that. I took all those points and said, oh, this must be the trend of potential energy from now on. That's extrapolation. All of that purple line that goes beyond that last data point, that's extrapolation. And for a careful scientist, and this is drilled into you when you're getting your PhD in chemistry, a careful scientist understands that the extrapolation has to be over a very small range compared to the range over which the data have been collected. Specifically because nature throws curves at you like I just showed you. And even though I had a lot of data in that second extrapolation, it still wasn't enough. My extrapolation went much farther than it should because in the end, I didn't have enough data to support that extrapolation. So the way we make sure that we're not making a big mistake is we keep the extrapolation range small, and then we compare to the data that we actually measure. To believe in an ancient Earth, however, you have to do exactly the opposite. You have to take measurements that have been made for the past 100, 150 years and extrapolate them over billions of years. That is simply poor science. Now, when I was a young PhD student, I figured there must be a good reason all of these scientists I admire are making this terrible extrapolation, because they all seem to believe the Earth is billions of years old, despite the fact that it made a very scientifically irresponsible extrapolation. So I figured eventually I'd find out what they saw as, all this great evidence that allows for this terrible extrapolation. The problem is, the more I learned, especially about my field, nuclear chemistry, the more I realized that there's nothing to support this bad extrapolation. And in fact, there's a lot of reasons to doubt that the extrapolation is even warranted. So that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the talk, but I thought I'd get that out of the way at first. One reason I think it was easy for me to follow the data, and one reason it's hard for many scientists to follow the data, is I already started out skeptical. And I don't think a lot of scientists do that. A lot of scientists simply, and I'm not disparaging them in any way. This is the way education is set up. Education is set up for you to believe your authority figures. And so they believe their authority figures and they think there's really good evidence for an old Earth. But I don't see that. In fact, I see great evidence for a young Earth. And one of the most reliable ways we can date something is if we have access to tree rings. The $20 word for that is dendrochronology. But everybody knows if I cut down a tree and count the rings, I can tell you how old that tree is. Now, that's not exactly true. Most trees, even the best references we have, do have a few multiple rings in some years. So dendrochronology kind of gives you an upper limit for the age. But nevertheless, if you can cut down a tree, count the rings, you have a really good estimate for how old it is. And I don't just have to have the tree. For example, I could have firewood. Somebody cuts down some firewood and doesn't, successfully burn it, then I can date the time they were making that camp, or at least making that fire, by looking at the tree rings, and that can tell me something about the age of the campsite or something like that. So in the end, dating with tree rings is very reliable. It's something we've used a lot, and it works really well. Well, if I look at the oldest living tree that's dated by tree ring dating, by dendrochronology, it's only got, it's a little older now, but it's got less than 5,000 rings in it. So it's less than 5,000 years old. Now, there are trees that people claim are older, but they're not dated they're not dated by tree ring dating. They're dated by other less reliable methods. The most reliable method of dating has the oldest tree that we know of as under 5,000 years old. And interestingly enough, you don't have to cut down the tree to do this. Trees are amazing organisms. You can put a hole straight through them and bring out the core of the hole that you drilled, and you can analyze the rings that way. As long as you plug up both ends of the tunnel you just made through the tree's fine. So anyway, that's the oldest living tree, Methuselah. Its tree rings have been counted, even though it wasn't cut down. It was just core sampled to do that. Now, here's the crazy thing. There's no known limit on the age of bristlecone pines. And even though this Methuselah is its actual location is a national secret, because they don't want some idiot taking a sample of it without knowing what to do. So it's a national secret. I don't know where that tree is. Most people don't know where that tree is, but it has been extensively studied. And the studies indicate that it is just as healthy as the younger trees that are only 1,000 years old. So not only is there no known limit on the age of these trees, this oldest tree doesn't look like it's about to die of old age. Now, if trees have been around, these kinds of trees are supposed to have been around for hundreds of millions of years. How is it that the oldest one is under 5,000 years? And I think it's because roughly 4,500 years ago, and remember, these trees do grow 2 or 3 rings sometimes in a year. So 4,790, 5,000 years old. That's an upper limit. It's probably a little lower than that. Roughly 4,500 years ago or so, there was a worldwide flood that would have killed all the trees. So I think dendrochronology actually gives us good evidence for the fact that there was a worldwide flood that covered the entire earth and killed all the trees. And then they had to grow again from the seeds that were deposited once the floodwaters receded and so forth. So I think that's a really good indicator that at least some global catastrophe happened roughly 5,000 years ago, and that's consistent with the typical young Earth creationist view. Probably to me, the strongest evidence of a young Earth comes from the Earth's magnetic field, and I'll tell you in the end why I think this is stronger than any of the other arguments I'm presenting. The few things we know about the Earth's magnetic field, we've been measuring it since about 1840, and over that entire time, it's been getting weaker. So we don't know what happened before 1840, but we know from 1840 on, it's gotten weaker. We know during the times in the past it has reversed. We know that because there are certain minerals that are magnetic, and they can be found in lava, in igneous rock. And they will always orient themselves in the direction of the magnetic field. And you can find actually igneous rock layers where the orientation is opposite of what it normally is. And about the only way to understand that is that the magnetic field reversed, and sometimes the North Pole was actually the South Pole of the magnet. If I look at our solar system, some planets have one, most of them do, some do not. So where does this magnetic field come from? Well, we think we know that, and I think pretty much everyone agrees on this, that there are large electrical currents flowing through the outer core of the Earth. And there's a lot of support that these currents are the source of Earth's magnetic field, because I can make an electromagnet by just running a current through a coil of wires. And so if I have an electrical current running through the outer core, as long as some of that current is all running in the same direction, I'm going to produce a magnetic field. And there are several lines of evidence that indicate that's what happens. The difference in how we look at it depends on how we think this magnetic field got started. The young Earth creationists have a theory, sometimes called the rapid decay theory. It's sometimes called the Humphreys theory, because Humphreys is the guy who came up with it. But it's he says that if you look in 2 Peter, it talks about the Earth being made of water and by water. And that has certain magnetic consequences. And assuming that the Earth started out during the supernatural creation, started out as a ball of water, in the end, that would produce a certain kind of electrical current in the core, which would produce a certain kind of magnetic field. The older theory, which is also called the dynamo theory, says the currents in the core are the result of the motion of the Earth as it spins on its axis and other effects like convection current effects and things like that. So they're not something that comes from the original setup of the Earth. It comes from how the Earth is behaving today. Now, the key is both of these theories are intensely mathematical, and they make predictions about the Earth's magnetic field as well as the magnetic fields of the other planets. However, there's one that's really superior and one that's really inferior. And of course, the inferior one is the old Earth one. And I see this a lot in data. On another podcast, I can talk more. Most of the old Earth data is incredibly inferior compared to young Earth data. And this is the case with the old Earth, the magnetic field theory. So, for example, the dynamo theory cannot even correctly predict whether or not a planet will have a magnetic field. So Mars, for example, has no planetary magnetic field, but the dynamo theory says it should. Mercury has a planetary magnetic field, but the dynamo theory says it shouldn't. And in fact, when we first sent an unmanned probe to Mercury, we almost didn't put a magnetometer on it, because everyone was so sure that the dynamo theory was right, and the dynamo theory said there's no magnetic field there. They almost didn't put a magnetometer on the unmanned space probe. In the end, magnetometers are cheap and light, so they ended up doing it just in case they were going to get surprised, and sure enough, they were surprised. The dynamo theory says, no, Mercury shouldn't have a planetary magnetic field, but the data say it does. Now, whenever you have a mathematical theory on something as large a scale as trying to describe a planetary magnetic field, there are always a few undefined parameters that you have to set. And so the typical way you do that is you use one thing as a calibration to set all those undefined parameters. And so when I use the Earth as a calibration to fit the dynamo theory, so I make the dynamo theory work for Earth, and then I use those same parameters for other planets, it's wrong on the strength of every other planet's magnetic field. So you can set it to accurately say what Earth's magnetic field is, but if you do that, it's wrong on the other planets. Also, and this is to me the biggest problem with the dynamo theory, rock samples from both the moon and Mars indicate that at one time they had magnetic fields, but now neither does. Mars has some magnetic characteristics because of some ores that are there, but it doesn't have a planetary magnetic field anymore, and the moon doesn't either. The dynamo theory really doesn't predict a magnetic field to decay to zero. So if you had a magnetic field at one time, according to the dynamo theory, you should probably always have it, as long as as you've got some sort of liquid core, as some sort of liquid portion in the core. But that's not the case. The moon and Mars did have a planetary magnetic field at one time, but now they don't. This is all taken care of by the rapid decay theory. The young Earth theory has been incredibly successful. So, for example, it correctly predicts the presence or absence of a magnetic field for each planet. So it's not, once we use, and once again, we still have to do the same thing. We have to use Earth as a calibration, set all the unknown parameters. Then we look at the other fields, the other planets, and it correctly predicts the presence or the absence. Using Earth as a calibration, it's actually correct on the strengths of the other planets' fields. And this is where I really think the rapid decay theory sets itself apart from a large amount of scientific speculation out there. The rapid decay theory was first written by Russell Humphreys in 1984, his classic paper, The Creation of Planetary Magnetic Fields. And at that time, the magnetic fields of Neptune and Uranus had not been measured. But he said, look, when we measure it, and we will, because the Voyager spacecraft, we're going to have spacecraft eventually to do that. So we're eventually going to measure those magnetic fields. We're going to find Neptune has this magnetic field, Uranus has this magnetic field. Well, in the 90s, the Voyager spacecraft did that. One measured Neptune, the other measured Uranus. The dynamo theory was 10,000 times off when it came to Uranus. And it was off with on Neptune as well, but not by factor of 10,000. The young Earth theory was right on the money. This is the core of science. If you ask any scientist who knows science, and I have to say there are a lot of scientists who don't know science because I've worked with some. Any scientist who knows science understands the thing that makes a scientific theory scientific is that it can make predictions. A scientific theory is not valid because it can explain known data. It is considered scientific if it can make a prediction about data that aren't known, and then that prediction can be confirmed by more experiments. This is the core of science. That's what makes the scientific theory scientific, and that's what happened here. And every now and again, you'll hear uneducated people like Bill Nye say that creation science doesn't make any predictions. That's incredibly wrong. Creation science makes a wealth of predictions, including this one, a numerical prediction about 2 different planets, both of which came true. Also, it correctly predicts that the fact that Mars and the moon both had a magnetic field at one time. Now, we had known this for a long time about the moon because moon rocks that were brought back from the moon indicate that at one time had a magnetic field structure, and it doesn't anymore. However, in 1984, we didn't know that about Mars. But in the 90s, there was a Mars meteorite that was analyzed that showed that Mars did have a planetary magnetic field. So that prediction about Mars was also made before it was determined. And here is, to me, the most striking of all of them. We first measured Mercury's magnetic field in 1975. Now, remember, old Earthers didn't even want to put a magnetometer on the spacecraft because they said, look, the dynamo theory says there's no magnetic field there. But somebody who was smarter said, yeah, we're going to put one on there. So we measured it in 1975. We came back with another spacecraft called Messenger in 2010 or 2011 or something like that. All right, so that's 35 years later, and the dynamo theory says there shouldn't be any significant change in the magnetic field of Mercury over that time period. The rapid decay theory says, oh yeah, it should be about 5% to 6% weaker, and in fact that's what it is. It's 6% weaker. So that's another unknown piece of data that was predicted before the measurement was made, and then the measurement validated the model. To me, that's not only the way science is supposed to supposed to be done, but it's also dramatic success. We've got really 4 predictions that were made before the data were collected. And they were all confirmed by the data. And the older theory was wrong about all 4. So in the end, I think that's, if I were to pick one thing, and that's not the way you do science. You don't do science by saying, okay, this is the one piece of data I'm going with. But if I were to pick just one thing that to me solidifies the idea that the Earth is young, it's probably this. Now, there are lots and lots of other pieces of evidence, like dendrochronology, like other things. And so this isn't the only thing, but I do think it's one of the strongest arguments we have. Also, there are things on Earth that are supposed to be old, but they appear young. And one of them, surprisingly, is the Earth-Sun system. Based on lots of different measurements, some of which I've done as a part of my nuclear chemistry research, we think we know how the sun works. It fuses light elements, in our sun, it's mostly hydrogen, into heavier elements. And once again, for our sun, it's mostly helium. And that fusion produces energy. And the energy we're getting from the sun is a result of that nuclear fusion. Well, the more heavy elements that are made, the more compact the gases become. That pushes everything closer together, so the higher the rate of fusion. Over time, suns like ours should get brighter the older they get. And that's very different from thinking about like burning a fire. You know, you set a fire, once it gets going really well, unless you keep adding wood, it's going to get dimmer. The sun's not like that. It's not a chemical reaction, it's a nuclear reaction. And the nuclear reaction itself is compacting the sun, which in turn speeds up the nuclear reaction. So as the sun gets older, it gets brighter and gives more energy to the Earth. So we could run the tape backwards. That means as we go backwards in time, the sun gets dimmer. And Dr. David Soderblom, who's astrophysicist, says, quote, according to standard solar models, at 1 billion years of age, the sun had something like 75% of today's luminosity. And under those conditions, we would get the Earth freezing over and it wouldn't recover because it would have a high albedo. Albedo is the amount of light that gets reflected. So basically he's saying, look, the Earth is going to be covered with ice and snow and stuff like that. That's very white. That reflects sunlight. So not only is the sun not giving us enough energy, we're reflecting a lot of it away before we can absorb it. So now, at 1 billion years ago, life was supposed to have appeared. And some paleontologists say it's way before that. But the Earth would have been way too cold for that. It would have been a snowball. And in fact, that's what some people call this problem, snowball Earth. And so even for 1 billion years, that doesn't seem to work for the Earth-Sun system. And please understand, this is a problem that nobody can fix, at least as far as we know right now. So this was a few years ago, but in December 2012, the Space Telescope Science Institute hosted a 2-day symposium entitled The Faint Early Sun, Paradox, Problem, or Distraction. So they wanted to figure out, is this really, really a problem for the Earth-Sun system over billions of years? And they brought together not only astrophysicists, but climate scientists and lots of other fields to really try and probe this question. The conclusion was that it was a real problem and nobody had a solution. A lot of people suggested, well, maybe, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere used to be a lot bigger. So even though the Earth was giving us less light, the atmosphere was absorbing more heat through the greenhouse effect. But the climate scientists said, nope, there's a limit to that. Here it is. There's no way this fixes the issue. Right. So in the end, all of the proposed solutions that people had come up with were basically shown to be inadequate. There was no solution. Several proposed solutions were shown invalid. No solution to the problem. And it still remains a problem to this day. Now, once again, one problem doesn't tell you it's wrong, just like one piece of data doesn't tell you it's right. What we're looking at is the totality of all of the data. But if I think of the totality of all the data, this certainly fits into a category of we don't understand this if the Earth is billions of years old. And I can do that with a lot of observables today. We don't understand really basic things if the Earth really is billions of years old, because in the end, there are all sorts of problems for taking a process that we've studied and trying to figure out how to keep it going for billions of years. That's a real problem. All right. Also, I think the most exciting thing that's come out over the last 20 years is two independent lines of evidence that indicate supposedly ancient fossils are in fact very young. The one that's near and dear to my heart, because it's right up my alley, are the fact that there are significant amounts of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Young Earth creationists have been saying for decades that we need to carbon date dinosaur bones, because young Earth creationists said, look, these dinosaur bones are only thousands of years old. There's going to be carbon-14 in them. We need to carbon date them. Evolutionists say there's no reason to carbon date dinosaur bones because they're billions of years old. There's going to be no carbon-14 in them. So in the end, it didn't happen for a long time until young Earth creationists started raising enough research money to find their own dinosaur fossils. And this is a picture of one of the young Earth creationists. This is a Triceratops fossil. And he is cutting into it because you're going to take the sample from inside the bone. So he has to cut the bone in to get the sample and so forth. And he's going to take samples of that bone, treat them in the prescribed way for carbon-14 analysis, and then send them off to a carbon-14 analysis lab to find out, A, is there any carbon-14 in it? And if so, how old does the carbon-14 system say that it is? Now, please understand that among radioisotopes, carbon-14 has a relatively short half-life. And so it decays away quickly compared to most. So, for example, let's suppose I had a lump of carbon-14 in my hand, and that lump of carbon-14 had 100 grams of mass. That carbon-14 would actually slowly decay into nitrogen-14, which is a gas. So if I actually could watch it happen, it would look like the lump was disappearing. It's because the carbon-14, the solid carbon-14 would turn into nitrogen gas. And every 5,700 years, half of it would go away. So after 5,700 years, the 100 would become 50. After another 5,700 years, the 50 would become 25. After another 5,700 years, 12.5. So the carbon-14 never actually goes away, but every half-life, whatever's left is cut in half. Well, the problem is no matter how much you start with, when you keep cutting it in half, it eventually gets too small for our or too low in amount for our detectors to detect. And in most dating circumstances, that turns into about 60,000 years. Some of the best tandem accelerator mass spectrometry systems can still detect carbon-14 if it's gone through slightly more than 10 half-lives. But after that, it gets really, really hard. So the theoretical limit's about 100,000 years. The practical limit is 60,000 years if you've got a really, really good setup. So let's just say 60,000 years. That's the maximum. So if I'm dating something with carbon-14, it's got to be 60,000 years old or younger. So a millions of year old fossil should not have any carbon-14 in it. Now, it's possible there's some contamination, but you can check for that. Also, the protocol that's used to collect these specimens and then the protocol that the carbon-14 dating lab follows are specifically designed to get rid of these contaminations. So contaminations are supposedly cleaned out of the system, but you can check to see, there are things you can do to check to see whether some of the carbon-14 is the result of contamination. But in the end, barring contamination, there should be no carbon-14 in any dinosaur fossil, because dinosaur fossils are millions of years old. However, every dinosaur fossil that has been sent to a radioactive dating lab, every sample that has been collected according to standard protocol, sent to a carbon-14 dating lab, and they follow the standard protocol as well, all had carbon-14 in them. And if you thought, okay, that carbon-14 can be used for dating, None of those states, none of those dinosaur samples were more than 39,000 years old. Now, I don't think they were 39,000 years old. I think there are problems with the carbon-14 dating system as well. And we can talk about that in the questions if you want. But the point is, if the evolutionists are right, and this is millions of years old, there shouldn't have been any carbon-14 in them at all. You shouldn't have been able to get a date. But instead, we did get dates, and they're all 39,000 or under. Now, this is surprising, you know. Someone who thinks that these, and if you want to believe these fossils are millions of years old, 65 million years old or more, that's fine. But you've got to come up with some explanation for this fact that there's unexpected carbon-14. Now, how are you going to come up with that explanation? Well, in my mind, if I've faced with data I don't understand, my first thought is do more experiments. So my first thought would be test more dinosaur fossils. However, that's not what evolutionists want to do. That's not what old earthers want to do. So the carbon-14 dating lab that these young earthers sent their samples to is called CAIS, and I, for the life of me, can't remember what that means, but it's it's the abbreviation CAIS. And when the facility found out what these young Earth creationists were publishing using their results, they sent an email that said part of it said the following, quote, "The scientists at CAIS and I are dismayed by the claims that you and your team have made with respect to the age of the Earth and the validity of biological evolution. Consequently, we are no longer able to provide radiocarbon services in support of your anti-scientific agenda." Now, let me ask you a question. What's more anti-scientific? Doing experiments to figure out the problem, or simply saying, we're not going to do any more experiments because we don't like the results? That's anti-scientific, and that's what the scientists at CAIS are doing. They're basically covering their eyes, covering their ears, and shouting real loud so that they don't have to deal with data they don't understand. Now, I have no problem with scientists believing that these fossils are millions of years old. But the last thing you should do if you've got carbon-14 in them is stop dating them with carbon-14. You've got to find some pattern to try to explain this carbon-14. And please understand, the young earthers have tried to see if it was a contamination. So, for example, they've done fossils out, or they've done samples on the outer edge of the fossil, the inner part of the fossil, deeper into the fossil. If it was contamination coming from the outside, there should be more carbon-14 the farther out in the fossil you go. They don't find that. So in the end, there's a lot of good evidence that this isn't contamination. This is something else. And so you've got to come up with some explanation. And you're not being scientific if your answer is, we're just not going to deal with it. And that seems to be what these guys are doing. And that's unfortunate. Now, speaking of dinosaur fossils, the other very amazing thing that's happened is soft tissue has been found in dinosaur fossils, soft, flexible tissue. And the first indication of this was in 2005. Mary Schweitzer, who still believes in an old Earth, and we'll make that clear. She hasn't changed her mind about the age of the dinosaur fossils just because she found soft, flexible tissue there. But nevertheless, she found soft, flexible tissue in a Tyrannosaurus Rex femur that was supposed to be 65 million years old. Now, this is really hard to understand because laboratory studies indicate that soft tissue decays pretty quickly. Also, the very proteins that make up this soft tissue, they have a lifespan as well. And of course, we haven't been able to measure this, but we have a lot of good models of proteins. And a lot of the proteins that make up this soft tissue should be decayed away after 30,000 years. So the very chemicals that make up this tissue shouldn't be able to last millions of years by any stretch of the imagination, yet they're there. That is, to me, an indication that the dinosaur fossils aren't as old as you think. And in fact, I don't know if you know who this is, but Jack Horner is kind of a popular paleontologist. He's kind of the Indiana Jones of paleontology. But anyway, he is the curator of the museum that Schweitzer was working for when she did this experiment. So his museum is the one that owns this fossil and owns the soft tissue. And I don't say own necessarily, but they have provenance over it, let's say. So he was actually offered $10,000, not to him, but to his museum, to use carbon-14 dating on that tissue. And he declined. And there's a taped phone call that says, quote, the spin creationists can get off this, quote, is not going to help us, end quote. So in the end, he said no. And please understand, this $10,000 grant was above and beyond the cost of the test. In addition, they said, we want you to do the soft tissue, but you can do 4 other artifacts from the museum as well. So the museum would be in for $10,000 plus the dates of 5 artifacts, 4 other ones, and the soft tissue. They declined. Once again, that's not science. If I want to understand this soft tissue, one of the first things we would do is carbon date it, because soft tissue shouldn't be that old. And so even people who believe the carbon-14 dating system works well, it should be able to be carbon dated. They won't allow it. Once again, not very scientific. Now, of course, this isn't the only case. Once Mary Schweitzer opened the world's eyes and said, look, there's soft tissue in these dinosaur bones, we better go looking for them, lots have been found. And one of the more interesting ones is from some young Earth creationists. They were digging in the Hell Creek Formation, found a Triceratops horn. Now, it wasn't from this particular skull. It was just a lone horn. But there are morphologies that tell you it's a Triceratops horn. The horn was soaked in weak acid for a month to remove minerals and strips of round tissue, to remove minerals. And in the end, strips of soft brown tissue were covered. They were stretched, all that. They ended up looking at this bone under the this tissue, or not the tissue, the bone, under a scanning electron microscope, and they saw this. These are bone cells. Now, they're dead. They're not living bone cells, but they're bone cells. They're very characteristic of bone cells. There really isn't another vertebrate cell that looks like this except bone cells. And it was found, not surprisingly, in bone tissue. So in the end, these are Triceratops bone cells. In the peer-reviewed paper that was published, here's what the author, Mark Armitage, says, quote, filopodial extensions, that's these tiny little hairs that are coming off. They're not really hairs. They're extensions of the cell. Filopodial extensions were delicate and showed no evidence of any permineralization or crystallization artifact, and therefore were interpreted to be soft. So we've got not living, dead bone cells, but the bone cells are still soft. Even tiny, tiny bits of them are still soft. They haven't been permineralized yet. That indicates that this can't be millions of years old. Now, here's what's interesting. Armitage publishes this paper, and it gets a little bit of buzz. It gets buzz among the students. And the students of this university know that they can go to Armitage's microscope lab and see Triceratops cells. So they do. He regularly had students coming into his lab asking to see the dinosaur cells. And he was happy to show them, happy to tell them what he thought that meant. However, and the horn was carbon dated to be 41,000 years old. But he was, he would tell the students what he thought that meant and everything. And in the end, the university fired him. And in fact, in the lawsuit that he filed, the one university official stormed into his office after the paper was published and shouted, quote, "We are not going to tolerate your religion in this department," end quote. So once again, evolutionists responded not by trying to figure out how there are soft cells in a Triceratops fossil, but just by firing the guy who found them. Now, of course, there was a lawsuit. It was settled for an undisclosed amount of money. So he's used that money to set up his own microscopy lab. He calls it the Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute. And he has actually isolated those bone cells from the bone. So now we have free floating dinosaur bone cells, Triceratops. And he's got other not just Triceratops now, he's got other species as well. Also, he's found other things. For example, he's found axons from nerve cells. And once again, they're soft. This all indicates that it's really, really young. And I wrote about this many, many years ago, and the famous evolutionist blogger P.Z. Myers tried to argue against this. And after 2 back and forths, he gave up because he couldn't answer basic questions about what's going on here. If you're interested in what Mark Armitage has found, he's got some great articles and videos on his website. He's publishing some of this stuff in peer-reviewed journals. So the Microscopy Today, for example, is a peer-reviewed journal. He's got several articles in there specifically showing the kinds of soft tissue he has found and the kind of cellular components he has found in dinosaur fossils. So I highly recommend going to that website. And once again, it's real easy to remember if you just remember what it is: Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute. So you can see that. So if you want sort of a encapsulation of why this scientist believes in a young Earth, first and foremost, I do think most of the Earth's features are best understood if the Earth is thousands of years old. As a scientist, when I'm trying to make a decision about any scientific issue, I try to stack the evidence. And whatever view has more evidence is the one I tend to lean towards. What I see is an enormous amount of data that makes the Earth look young, a little data that makes the Earth look old. On the other hand, I see an enormous amount of data that is unexplainable if the Earth is billions of years old, and only a little bit of data that's unexplainable if the Earth is thousands of years old. So I do think most of the Earth's features are best understood if the Earth is thousands of years old. From a scientific point of view, it's the safest view because you're avoiding that horrible extrapolation I talked about from the beginning. So if you want to be a careful scientist, you would lean towards that view just because of that, because it's a incredibly anti-science extrapolation to make. And also, most of the evidence for an ancient Earth is either contradictory or it involves physical processes we don't understand very well. So like from my field, there's some evidence that indicates the Earth is young, but there's also evidence that indicates the Earth is old. From my field, a lot of that evidence is based on processes we don't really understand very well, or have only been studied for about 100 years or so. So in the end, I think we don't understand much of the processes that produce this argument for the old Earth. But we do understand a lot of processes that indicate the Earth is young. So as a scientist, I think it's by far the most scientific position to hold, and that's why I hold it. Okay, I think that's it. So now, but I don't know what I don't know. Oh, there you go. Now I can stop sharing.
All right. Dr. J, that was excellent. I appreciate your enthusiasm and energy in presenting it as well. That flew by. Okay. I would not want to be an old Earth creationist or somebody that denies the truth of biblical creation attempting to refute that. That was great. I took a lot of notes based on your talk. Mm-hmm. What I want to start with, though, is you made a very important point where you discussed the gold standard of science, making testable and falsifiable predictions, right? So we have two models, creation, evolution. Which one is true? And I find we sometimes spend too much time discussing agnostic lines of evidence, pieces of evidence or observations that both models can account for, Dr. J. But where we really need to focus is where you discussed making future testable predictions, not just looking at current observations or data and then making retrodictions. I find the evolutionary model does that a lot, or we'll present them contradictory data and they'll come up with a rescue device, right? Storytelling. And so you discussed the predictions from Dr. Russell Humphreys on the magnetic fields of other planets. That's fantastic. And so could you elaborate a little bit on why it's so important for in science for us to make testable predictions where we don't know the outcomes yet? We have to do future experiments to figure out whether they're true or not.
Yeah. So if I come up with an explanation for data, that might have some value, but it's more like a bedtime story. If I know what conclusion I need to reach, I can figure out a story to tell to reach that conclusion. If I don't know the conclusion to reach and I happen to reach it, that indicates my reasoning is probably okay. It's not a goal. It's not 100%, but it is the gold standard of science. So for example, let me give you a case where it didn't work. If you're a chemist, you probably have made Lewis structures. Lewis structures were produced by Gilbert Lewis based on a flawed model of the atom, based on a cubical model of the atom. Now, it turns out the magic number that he used for cube was 8. And it turns out a closed valence shell has 8. So in the end, he just, by coincidence, figured out a way to draw molecules that works using a bad model. So sometimes you can come up with a prediction, and so he predicted, okay, based on that, he predicted these molecules should exist, and they were able to make them. But it was based on a flawed model. Now, we still use that flawed those Lewis structures today, because even though it's based on a flawed model, it turns out to be useful. So it doesn't always work, but it usually works. And what I see is the majority of evolutionary science is making up stories to explain data. The majority of creation science is making predictions about things. So, for example, evolutionists have told us since the 1970s that the vast majority of the human genome is junk. Creationists have been predicting since that time, basically, that no, the vast majority of human DNA can't be junk. It's impossible. And of course, we now know that the young Earth creationists were right on that point. Well, and I got to give the intelligent design people, because they said the same thing. But anyway, you see that over and over again. Young Earth creationists said there has to be some planned mutational mechanism, some mechanism that produces mutations in response to stress. And those mutations are designed to relieve stress. And 10 years ago, designed mutations were found. So in the end, that's what we see in young Earth creation science. We see a lot of predictions that come out true. What we see in evolution is mostly storytelling.
Well, it's a great response, especially when it comes to the ancestry debate.
Yeah.
What's true? Universal common descent, that all life is related, plants and animals, or separate ancestry, what the Bible clearly teaches that humans are separate and special, independently created and separate from any other form of life, including plants, of course, and chimpanzees. And so we have a head-to-head prediction there, which you mentioned, junk DNA. We as creationists, we would expect that the vast majority of the genome is functional. Evolutionists would expect that the vast majority of the genomes of living organisms reflect evolutionary leftover.
Of highly evolved. So
right.
lowly evolved animals might have pretty decent genomes, but the more evolved you are, the more junk should be in your genome.
Right. Good point. As in the more, like, for example, humans today, I've heard them say, oh, well, max, we're looking at probably 10, maybe 12% functionality. But like you've demonstrated, well, no, we've got the ENCODE project and subsequent projects that have shown that at least 80% of the genome is biochemically active, which I would say suggests beneficial functions, because then the evolutionists would say, oh, that's just noise, that's just spurious, that's not real function. I'm curious, Dr. J, how would you respond to an evolutionist who says, okay, 80% activity, sure, but that's just a lot of noise, that's not real function, Dr. J?
Well, I asked the evolutionists, why do humans have a better sense of eyesight than gorillas or than apes? And the answer is supposed to be, well, once humans started to live in the plains, they needed better eyesight. Their smelling wasn't all that important. Evolution is always trying to save energy. So we devolved our sense of smell to save energy, and our eyesight got better. Because evolution's always trying to conserve energy. That's right. The explanation for why human eyesight's or human smell is worse than ape, but human eyesight's better. And yet, when we get to 80% of the genome being functional, their explanation is, evolution gets to waste energy all the time. We're gonna transcribe 60% of the genome that we don't use, because evolution can waste as much energy. And there's an old book. I really wish he would have written another one. It's called The Biotic Message. And I can't even remember what the guy's name is. I think it may be Milne or something like that. But he basically said evolution is simply this smorgasbord of explanations. And for each piece of data, you choose what explanations work. That's not science.
Right.
That's storytelling.
Well, I think your explanation was perfect, because that's why evolutionists, they will want to explain everything, regardless of how contradictory it is, to another point that they'll make, like you said, with the humans and gorillas and comparing eyesight, where if this 60% transcription or 80% biochemical activity were just noise, well, like you said, that would be wasteful of energy and resources for the cell. Every time you add a single nucleotide to a growing RNA chain, you're consuming energy. You're consuming ATP. So if evolution
and using resources too, you're not only consuming energy, you're using the resources to build those nucleotide bases and so forth.
That's a good point. So that means transcription is an energy intensive and resource intensive process. So you'd think if evolution were true, well, over time, evolutionary mechanisms like selection would weed out a lot of that genetic baggage to what? Preserve resources for the cell. So to me, that would suggest that the majority of that activity and transcription is functional. So, okay, that's really good. And I'm curious because you mentioned the prediction with the magnetic fields that Dr. Russell Humphreys made, and then the rate team, as you mentioned, Dr. Baumgartner, Dr. Snelling, so on and so forth. They made other predictions, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on the one that I find to be quite fascinating, as I feel critics have not done a good job to counter it, but the helium that they find in the zircon crystals that shouldn't be there. I'm curious if you could speak to that and your overall thoughts on that piece of evidence, Dr. J.
Yeah, I don't know how deep I want to get into this, but basically they found helium trapped in these zircon crystals, and the helium had to come from radioactive decay. Well, if radioactive decay is slow, that helium is produced slow. Well, we know helium diffuses out of everything. That's why a helium balloon gets smaller over time. Helium diffuses right out of the latex. Well, it diffuses right out of the zircon as well. The problem is, if the helium is produced slowly, it ought to have plenty of time to get out of the zircon. So in the end, there shouldn't be much helium there, because pretty much as slowly as it's made, it slowly leaks out. However, what they found was unexpectedly large amount of hydrogen, or of helium. And the thought is maybe the helium produced by radioactivity got produced really quickly in some short event, and therefore hasn't had time to fully diffuse out. Now, that's just storytelling at this point. But what Humphreys did, as well as Baumgartner and a couple other people, is they basically said, all right, let's assume that the standard old Earth model is right. So helium gets produced at this rate. Then if that's the case, to come up with the helium that we have in this zircon, this would have to be the rate at which helium diffuses out. Because if we know the rate it's being made, and we know how much is there now, we know how much had to get out. So we know the rate at which it has to get out. However, let's take a young Earth model where there is this burst of radioactive decay early on that produces an enormous amount of helium in a very short time. And then what would the diffusion rate have to be to see the helium we see today? Those diffusion rates were, logarithmically different. I can't remember, but well over a factor of 100 different. They had never been measured. So they went to a team that does this for a living. It's what they do, measure diffusion rates from crystals. And they didn't say why. They just said, we need to know how fast helium gets out of zircon at these temperatures. And so they measured it, and their young Earth prediction was right on the money. Every dot went through the line. And the old Earth prediction way off, factors of 10 off. And so what's interesting about this is, of course, evolutionists now employ the rescue device.
Right.
And the rescue device is that over time, the crystal gets annealed because of changing temperatures and all of that. And that leads to different diffusion. So I actually contacted the same research group that Humphreys had employed. And I said, you guys could do this. You guys could anneal a crystal and actually measure the diffusion rate. And you wouldn't be simulating millions of years, but you could at least see, does this annealing really affect it a lot? And he wrote back, he said, I don't want to do anything related to Russell Humphreys. He's a very strange man. And that was it.
Wow.
That was all he said. And I was like, yeah, once again, that doesn't sound very scientific.
That doesn't sound scientific at all. No.
If I had the ability, the resources, and the knowledge, the problem is that kind of data, it would take me years just to develop technique enough to do it. But if I had the technique already and had the resources, I'd do it. because it's fascinating. It's just a fascinating question at all. Does this really affect diffusion? But also it would bear, and if the evolutionists are right, their rescue device works.
Right.
So why not try and test it?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
nobody has.
Wow, that's great. I mean, like I said at the beginning,
and I'm not sure anneal is the right term, but basically the changes in temperature.
No, you're right. I've seen critics. I've seen old Earth creationists attempt to refute or counter the helium and zircons with that kind of rescue device. And so, and Dr. Andrew Stelling, we had him on for a seminar where he discussed radio halos at great length, and we also got into the helium and zircons, and he had a very similar story to your story, showcasing the bias from the old Earth creationists, from those that reject the young Earth, where they don't even want to do the experiments, Dr. J.
Yes, exactly.
Because it might just contradict their view on origins.
And can I say something about Dr. Snelling real quick?
Of course, yeah.
I've never met him, but I love the guy. When I was in the late 1990s, I was still doing a lot of computer programming because nuclear chemists have to do all computer programming. And so I started doing white papers for businesses to certify them as year 2000 compliant. And so I had those, but I was a little concerned. I mean, I really didn't think it was going to be a big deal, and my white papers seemed to work and everything, but so I actually got a hold of Dr. Snelling. And I said, would you mind, just because he was still in Australia at that point, I don't know if he still is, would you mind calling me when the year 2000 hits for you and letting me know if everything's okay? And he did. He was so nice. And he was obviously very happy and everything.
Right.
But it was just so nice of him. It had nothing to do with his field, nothing to do with creationism. It was just something that would help me out. And he was willing to do that. So thank you again, Dr. Snelling, for that.
And we've had another 26 years of being able to defend biblical creation. And so your answer is fascinating, because we have the young Earth model here, the old Earth model here. If the old Earth model is true, then we should find very little helium, if I understand correctly. Not saying that it should be completely absent from helium.
There should be a level there.
Lead, so a little bit. And what we find is, if the Earth is young, we should find an abundance of helium, and that's what we find. And so I'm wondering, okay, to get the helium, we have uranium to lead. As uranium decays into lead, obviously there's a chain, there's a process, different steps. You have helium being produced. It's a slippery molecule, so it leaves through the rock quickly, or the zircon.
It's really just because it's small.
Okay, so it's small, and so okay,
reactive.
So because we do find basically uranium, lead, and a lot of helium, we find all three. Does that mean the best explanation, whether you're regardless of your view, we're young Earth creationists, does that mean that lead all did come from uranium, but it came from uranium in an accelerated manner to basically keep all that helium, Dr. J?
Yeah, no, it's only one particular isotope of lead.
Okay. So
almost all naturally, I think maybe all naturally occurring elements have more than one isotope. Isotopes are groups of atoms that have the same number of protons, therefore they're the same element, but they have different numbers of neutrons. And so there's only one isotope of lead, one combination of protons and neutrons that come from that decay process. So you can have lead that never came from uranium. It just isn't that particular isotope. If you have that particular isotope of lead, then the best explanation is it came from radioactive decay chain.
And so it would have been through an accelerated radioactive decay, though.
Yeah, I think so. And that leads to problems. Let's be quite upfront about that. The great thing about science is we can't, the idea that we're going to figure out everything is not very tenable.
Right.
And that's, and so the great thing about science is you learn one thing, it brings up a few more questions. And of course, there are several independent lines of evidence that radioactive decay rates can change.
Right.
And there are at least two lines of evidence, both done by the rate team, that indicate that radioactive decay for at least a short period was much faster in the past. But radioactive decay produces energy, and fast radioactive decay produces an enormous amount of energy. And that's a big problem. I mean, it's so big that Humphreys wants to solve it by putting that energy into the expansion of the universe. And I have no idea how any kind of model that would allow radioactive decay energy to push the expansion of the universe. But that's how desperate not desperate, but that's how far reaching we are trying to figure out an explanation. I peer reviewed a paper a couple of years ago where one nuclear physicist is talking about coalescence of protons and neutrons within these radioactive isotopes. And that could absorb some of the energy. And that was intriguing. I recommend it for publication. It did get published, but I do think there's still, I don't think that's the real answer, but it might lead us to the answer. But anyway, so that's a problem. And I'm not, so if we had this enormous amount of radioactivity in the past, which it looks like we did, then we don't understand why the Earth isn't completely melted. So we have to figure that out.
Well, and if we had every single answer, then I would be bored, because I like the research. I like research projects. And so I wonder, a lot of that heat and energy created, could that be utilized through different means? I mean, firstly, to get those plates moving during catastrophic plate tectonics, wouldn't that require a lot of heat and energy in the first? I'm not saying that would solve it, but I mean, some of that heat and energy through accelerated decay.
The whole issue is you got to have a mechanism. I can take heat and turn it into motion using a heat engine, but a heat engine converts that heat into motion through a very specific mechanism. I don't know of any natural mechanism that'll do that. So that's an issue. You could argue maybe if it was happening mostly in the deeper parts of the mantle, it would cause the convection currents in the mantle to get faster, because the heat's rising, and that would be pushing the plates apart. The problem is that's not where most of the radioactivity is. So, or at least we don't think it's where it is. So I don't know of a good mechanism that will turn that heat into some useful form of energy. And obviously, the flood itself is supernatural. As scientists, we do try to avoid supernatural in our models. But if it's supernatural, then we can't just say that's not a possibility. So yes, it's possible that God miraculously took that heat and did something with it. Put it in the expansion of the universe, put it in the plate tectonics. But obviously, as a scientist, I'd rather develop a model that uses natural processes.
What if, and I'm just kind of curious, because I'm thinking, okay, today we understand the core and the mantle's very hot. What if it wasn't as hot in the pre-flood world, and just hypothetically, a lot of that heat produced during accelerated decay in the deep rocks was taken into the mantle or core, and then it would heat it up just a little bit? And I'm just kind of brainstorming.
Sure.
I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, now, depending on where you do this could work. You'd have to be thinking that there's something fundamentally different, though, because right now what's driving the Earth's magnetic field is a certain temperature in the outer core. Okay. And so if you want to say, like, for example, during the creation week and during the time Adam and Eve were in Eden, maybe we didn't need a magnetic field. Maybe there was something else. We don't know. And then when the flood occurred, for example, that accelerated radioactive decay would probably have to happen during the curse, because after the curse, we're going to need that magnetic field. So, the Earth is so incredibly well designed.
Right.
It's really hard. It's really hard to say, well, what if this wasn't there before?
Yeah.
It's really hard because it's also well designed and finely tuned.
Just through research on this, I've looked at the, reservoir of the core of the mantle and how hot it is. And apparently, I mean, it could act as a huge reservoir to take up a lot of heat and not even change it really by much. So are you saying that in order for that to take place, that at creation it would have to be drastically different, or just a little bit different, Dr. J?
It would, because the thing is, when you're talking about, the mantle can hold a lot of heat, you're talking about heat produced in a conventional way. When we're talking about heat produced by radioactivity, it's per radioactive decay, it's a large amount of energy. And if I'm wanting what ends up being 1 billion or so years worth of radioactive decay, all concentrated into, say, the flood or something like that, that's an enormous amount of heat very quickly. Now, I did a calculation, one of the, and I could probably bring it on later because I don't remember the details well enough just off the top of my head. I did a calculation where if we spread this accelerated radioactive decay out for a whole year, then the temperature rise is not going to be really unhandleable. And it could do what you're talking about. It could be absorbed by the mantle and so forth. But the problem with is if you're expanding that over the whole year, how are you protecting the organisms?
Well, that's a good point. Are you referring to like the radiation would, and obviously the heat too, but the radiation?
The radiation. No, we're trying to protect the organisms, including the people, from the radiation.
Right.
So, that I'm saying that the heat problem goes away, but now we got a shielding problem.
Yeah. Well, and then I wonder, I've heard Dr. Snelling, and I'm not saying this resolves it, but he's mentioned, well, we'd have miles of water because of the flood.
No, that's a good point.
Perhaps that could shield Noah and the animals from some of the radiation, at least.
Water's not really great at shielding gamma rays, but it would completely shield all the alpha and beta rays for sure, and any neutrons as well. The only thing, that's a possibility. I'd have to see a lot more calculations about gamma radiation, though.
Right, it's easier to just say or claim.
Yeah.
You got to follow it up with some math. So, Dr. J, it's a really fascinating topic, and I'm curious because you also mentioned the C14 in diamonds and in fossils, and this also relates to the rate team, the rate project, helium and zircons, radio halos, C14. And we've had several critics bring up potential explanations, which you showed in your presentation why contamination wouldn't work, Dr. J. But I'm curious, if you're just engaging in a discussion with a critic and they say, okay, well, we find, and here's what I think they miss a lot of the times, though, Dr. J, is that we have a high C14 signal, from my understanding, basically everywhere you look for the most part in the geologic column. I mean, you find it in coal, dinosaur fossils, and diamonds, which are real deep within the earth, claim to be billions of years old, the hardest substance on the planet, from my understanding. So anyways, if they were to say contamination, but both in the environment and in the lab, because I've heard some appeal to the lab, but I've also heard some appeal to environmental contamination to explain a little bit of the radiocarbon that we find. I'd be curious what the best response is.
Well, contamination in a lab is a problem, and these good labs spend a lot of time dealing with it. So, for example, when we're trying to find the baseline, like if I just run a particle accelerator with anything in it, any sample in it, doesn't have to have even known to have carbon in it. So I put a calcium carbonate sample in there to try to accelerate the calcium ions. I'm going to get some carbon-14. It's just the way it is, right? So if you run a blank, if you run nothing, you get 0. But if you run anything, you get some carbon-14. So they run these non-carbon based samples that still give us carbon-14 to get sort of the average low level, so that you know what the lab's contamination level is. And and there are some of those diamonds that at least fall into that level. So you could at least say, well, some of those diamonds might just be background, but none of the dinosaur bones do.
Okay.
None of the dinosaur bones come close to the contamination level in the lab. So no, that's not tenable for most of what we're talking about. And the problem with environmental contamination is you expect environmental contamination to be higher towards the outer edge of the fossil and lower as you go into the fossil. And when these guys did, when this Hugh Miller's group did this, and they actually presented their results, at a national convention, that then their presentation got scrubbed from the paperwork afterwards. Wow. But their presentation was accepted and they gave it. But then it was scrubbed later. But in that presentation, they actually showed there's no pattern. If I take the carbon-14, there's always variation in what you measure, depending on where you go. But they say sometimes the fossils, it's more carbon-14 on the outside, but sometimes it's less carbon-14. There's no discernible pattern in where you take the sample and the amount of carbon-14. So that heavily speaks against environmental contamination. Some folks want to say, well, there's natural radioactivity around, and natural radioactivity can turn carbon-12 into carbon-14. I've already done calculations published on my blog that say that's not ever going to come anywhere close to the levels that we're seeing.
Wow.
Not even in diamonds, much less in dinosaur bones.
Well, I love how comprehensive you've been, and how you've left no stone unturned, because you've done a lot of the calculations yourself. And so with the radioactivity that you just mentioned, that could create some of that radiocarbon that critics would look to, is that along the same lines as this argument? Because I've heard this one from old Earth creationists like Dr. Hugh Ross, for example. They'll say, well, carbon-14 in diamonds and coal can be explained by in situ production through uranium and thorium decay. Yeah. So obviously
that's what he's saying. These guys produce, nuclear reactions, and those nuclear reactions can lead to carbon-14.
Okay. And it doesn't work.
For somebody who doesn't know nuclear reactions, that sounds really reasonable. But as soon as you start doing the calculations, because it's not, and in my calculations, I'm assuming all the best. Like, for example, if I'm going to have a neutron absorbed by a nucleus, if the neutron's moving quickly, it's hard for the nucleus to absorb it. If the neutron's moving more slowly, it's easier. So the most likely way to catch a neutron is if the neutron has been thermalized. So I'm assuming all the neutrons are thermalized, which isn't possible. But nevertheless, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. All the neutrons are thermalized. It's still not enough.
Yeah. Wow. So really then, as I've seen some creationists say, C14 is a creationist's best friend, because the rescue devices that have been put forth. And so if I'm understanding what you're saying on this one, to produce the measurable C14 at the levels that we consistently observe, you'd need a lot more uranium and thorium, basically, near the sample. Yeah. Would it be thousands, 10,000, 13,000 times more, roughly?
I don't remember. I know it was at least 10 to the 4, so that's 10,000. Wow. But I can't remember what like I said, it's been a long time since I've looked at it. But yeah, it's not tenable at all as a explanation. Now, I have to say that, still, I would say carbon-14 decay and so forth is part of those things we don't understand really well. I mean, we've measured it. We think we have a model for why it works and all of that, but it's not something that we've had hundreds of years to study. Right. So in the end, there could be something we're missing. There could be some great explanation for why there's carbon-14 in there that we're missing. But what I am saying is all of the proposed ones that I've seen don't work.
So I've heard critics say this, and I see a couple critics in the chat right now. We've got a great live chat, Dr. J. Okay. You've generated some good discussion. So that's what we like. Want to plant some seeds. So they're saying, and it's been said in the past too, that, okay, fine. So we shouldn't find C4. If every atom in the universe were made of radiocarbon, then we shouldn't find really any C14 through decay in a million years, 500,000 years, I've heard it said. Okay, so we find a lot of C14. But why don't we find the C14 levels consistent with 6,000? Why do we still find, when we look at the coal, 40,000, 50,000? Why not 6,000, Dr. J?
Yeah, well, I mean, remember, the whole reason we have carbon-14 in any measurable quantities on Earth is because of nuclear reactions that are occurring in the atmosphere based on particles that are coming from the sun, right? And what we assume is that on average, the sun has had basically the same, over 60,000 years anyway, had basically the same level of activity. So we've had basically the same level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. There's no reason to assume that. And as a matter of fact, we can actually test that assumption by using tree rings, because we know how old the tree ring is. When a new tree ring forms, the old one's dead, and it acts just like a dead fossil. So I can take a tree ring that's the 500th one in, and I know that's a 500-year-old fossil. And I can measure the amount of carbon-14 in that fossil. I can correct it for 500 years worth of decay. And I would get the amount of carbon-14 that was in the atmosphere that tree was in that year, in that location. Wow. Now, we've got this for almost 3,000 years worth of tree rings. And it's a widely varying function that goes from about negative 40% to about positive 30%. So in the end, over the course, there's a 70% variation just over the last 3,000 years. So to think that on average it's pretty much been the same over the history of the Earth is crazy. It's nonsense. There's no reason to believe that. So I wouldn't expect the carbon-14 dating system to work specifically because of that. Now, what I will say is, for those years we have tree rings, we now have a calibration. And so we can actually calibrate the carbon-14 dating system from now to 3,000 years ago using tree rings. And it actually produces really good, consistent results. So carbon-14 is a pretty reliable system for present to 3,000 years ago. After that, we run out of tree rings. So now we have to start using other things like, coral growth, which is really uneven. We have to use other things that are significantly less reliable. And so the calibration gets worse the farther back you go. So I am not surprised that a bone that's 4,000 years old carbon dates at 39,000 years old, because I really don't think the sun's activity was the same back then. I think the carbon-14's calibration gets worse, and when you get out to 40,000 years, it's almost like guessing. So yeah, I don't see that as a reasonable. And I don't see any of these, as a nuclear chemist, I don't see any of these radioactive dating systems as reasonable, except for ones like the carbon-14 from 0 to 3,000 years, where we have an independent calibration. Once we have an independent calibration, it works really well.
That's a good point. So are you saying the closer we get to the flood, it's more reliable because we have the...
Well, I'm not sure closer get to the flood. The fact is, the oldest tree ring's 4,500 years old. We're not allowed to cut enough of that tree up to do the calibration. So the only data I've seen goes out to about 3,000, 3,500 years old. That's basically 100
years or so after the
flood. Well, which would be, yeah. So I'm just saying we don't have data to calibrate any farther back. Well, we have data. It's just not reliable data. It's not tree ring stuff anymore. So we only have tree rings back a certain amount of time. So we only have a good calibration back a certain amount of time.
And the bigger picture point too, for those in the audience, from my understanding here, is the fact we find the C14. Sure, there's enough radiocarbon that correlates with 40,000, 50,000. But the fact is, there really shouldn't be that amount of C14 present in, let's say, coal or dinosaur fossils, which brings me to this question, because I'm curious as to your thoughts, Dr. J. In a way, you did address this earlier when you were comparing the diamonds, how you said maybe contamination in the environment could explain some of the diamonds, but not the dinosaur fossils. So the questioner here, minor guy, appreciate it. He says, apparently professional labs routinely find trace C14 in petroleum, diamonds, and marble.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about, how you put anything in there, you're going to get some carbon-14.
You're going to get a little something. And so then he shifts here about the dinosaur fossils. He says, what makes you think dinosaur bones C14 is any different, though?
Oh, it's just amount. I'm not saying the fact that it's dinosaur bones is any different. We these guys who do these this carbon-14 dating with the tandem accelerator mass spectrometry, they have spent a lot of time trying to get a baseline for their background, for the trace carbon-14 in whatever they put in there. And so they have really good data on how much is trace. And how much is trace is usually, depending on the lab, the amount of carbon-14 that would indicate something like 50,000 years old, or maybe 55,000 years old, very low levels. Well, all of the dinosaur bones are much higher than that, much higher than the background, So like when I've got a Geiger counter out, I'll get background radiation, but when I point it at a radioactive source, it goes crazy, because now the radiation is above background. Same thing here. The amount of carbon-14 in the dinosaur bones is just way above background. So background can't explain that.
So when, for example, I'll screen share here just to go through a couple slides. When you say AMS background detection limit, this is from Dr. John Baumgartner. He did a seminar here on CPT, but he also gave a separate presentation on C14 for Logos research associates. And so he showed from the secular radiocarbon literature, because excuse me, some people in the chat were also saying, well, how come this data is not published in the secular literature? And perhaps you could answer that. From my understanding, a lot of it is.
A lot of it is. And, like I said, sometimes it's presented at conferences and then gets scrubbed.
Well, right. Gets scrubbed because it doesn't fit the paradigm, right?
Yeah.
Or it doesn't look good.
Yeah.
So like in this slide, for example, in the this one here with the 10 coal samples, I think the coal is really fascinating. Maybe let's focus on this one.
Yeah, it's hard for me to see. I don't know if you can make that bigger.
Yeah,
I'm old.
No, that's okay, brother. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. That's better. Yeah.
So Dr. Baumgartner has here, for example, 247 times the AMS detection limit. Is that connected to what you're saying with the
not really. We're talking about two different things. The
Okay.
AMS detection limit is what level of carbon-14 can you detect at all?
Oh, I see.
So how low can you go? But that's not considering the noise. That's not considering the background. So it's like a radio antenna that has a certain receptivity. It can receive the signal real clearly, but if there's a whole bunch of background, it's still not going to see the signal, right?
Okay.
So in the end, that's sort of the precision, but that doesn't account for the background. And what Minor Guy is talking about, which is really real, is that it doesn't matter what you put in there. As soon as you get rid of a blank, as soon as you put a real sample in there, for a real sample from the world in there, you're going to get some carbon-14. But like I said, they spend a lot of time figuring out how much that sum is. And that sum is probably enough to explain, for example, DECS11, the second one. And then DECS16, the 50. When I see anything above 50,000 in terms of C14 age, I'm willing to say that may be background. Because that we really, there are some AMSs that say they can get to 60,000. That's really, really tough. And when I was a grad student, I worked at one of the I didn't do radioactive dating, but the lab I worked in was one of the premier radioactive dating facilities. And they looked skeptically at anything above 50,000 years for carbon-14 because of this background issue. So I could say a lot of that, and maybe even all of it, but maybe not DECS18, the 44,000 one. That's well above background. So the idea is you've got all this noise. Where are your signals well above that noise? I think that 44,000 is probably well above the noise.
So that would be well above the noise, suggesting that it could be legit radiocarbon. Okay.
Yeah, that it's not coming from the background.
Oh, I see.
Coming from whatever the lab's background is.
So then when it comes to the diamonds, for example, here, rate C14 measurements of 6 African diamonds times AMS.
Yeah, see, once again, that limit's not really taking into account the background. So
right. So
I would be more interested. I would really love, and I don't know if he has this. I looked for it when he originally published, and I didn't see it in his first paper. I would like to see, because these labs will give you, their background samples, the results for their background samples. And that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see how far above the background these numbers are. And that's what I'm not seeing in this.
Right.
But the thing that's nice about diamonds is really hard to contaminate them.
Yeah, right. Yes.
And that's why you'd like to see some carbon-14 in diamonds. So certainly I'm for doing more investigation. I'm just saying those numbers aren't nearly as convincing to me, because they're pushing the limit of what you can get above the background.
And that's why you'd be more confident with the dinosaur fossils, because we find enough of it to suggest that it's legit.
Yeah, you find significantly more, and so now you've got the noise is down here, your signal's up here.
Wow.
So so your signal's not being affected by the noise hardly at all. Whereas with diamonds, it's right down here, so it could be being
close
by the noise.
So if you were to, as you have with your presentation, if you're discussing this with a skeptic or somebody who's on the fence, you would focus most on the dinosaur fossils with C14 as compared to diamonds and coal?
Well, not necessarily coal, because coal has a large amount too.
Okay.
So it's really these diamonds. And once again, I can see the attraction of diamonds because contamination is not an issue.
Right.
But at the same time, I've never seen a study that shows me that those diamonds are unambiguously above the background. I've not seen a study that tells me that. Whereas the amounts that are in both coal and dinosaur bones, they are unambiguously above the background. There's got to be something besides the AMS background in there.
Wow, so good, so helpful, Dr. J, on that one. I really appreciate that. So, how does because your first point or your second point was the decaying magnetic field, exponential decay. I mean, from my understanding, you go back even 60,000 years, the magnetic field would be strong enough, comparable to a neutron star, basically, to tear the atoms of our body apart. It'd be very, very strong. And you mentioned the dynamo model, and you mentioned some of the explanations that the old Earth proponents have that might not work. And so if we're in a discussion with a critic, we talk about the decaying magnetic field and how it provides good evidence for a young Earth. And they say, well, the problem is the field reverses and regenerates. And okay. But to them, that's enough to basically counterbalance. And so it's not an issue for an old Earth. What would be a good response?
Well, but the point is these models, the dynamo model and the rapid decay model, they both take all of that into account.
Okay.
Right. So I agree. If you're talking about, I think the first guy that talked about the decaying magnetic field was Barnes, back from probably the 1980s or something like that. And he basically said, extrapolate it back and pretty soon the Earth becomes a neutron star. That's not a good argument.
Okay.
Because in the end, I don't know what's going. I don't know that I can just extrapolate it backwards and everything. When I can develop a model that tries to take everything into account, and then that model predicts something that we later find out is true.
Okay.
That's a completely different level of evidence now, right? Because now what you have to tell me is, how does this wrong model get these 4 predictions right? And once again, it can happen. Gilbert Lewis showed us it can happen, but nevertheless, no one's done that. So if you want, you can say reversals and all that all you want, but you have to tell me, how did this wrong model produce 4 correct predictions when what you think is the right model couldn't produce 1? That's the issue.
That's a really good point. So it's not a good idea for us as creationists to just put it back in a linear fashion, exponential, 60,000 years, boom, that's confirming evidence. We need to take into account everything, make future testable predictions, which have been done, where there's basically 4 confirmed predictions. So if this model is wrong, then how do you explain the 4 correct predictions that came about from it?
Especially when the model you think is right couldn't get any of them.
That's
the other issue.
That's a good point.
Because, as a scientist, I remember my very first time as a graduate student, I came up with some kind of novel results in an experiment. It wasn't my thesis, it was something else. And I gave a presentation, and I, of course, gave the interpretation that my PhD advisor said. But by the end of the discussion, there were 3 other interpretations. Right. And all of them could explain the data. So what we had to do was then we had to find another experiment that would test between those 4. Turns out our explanation was one of the wrong ones. But the point is, that's how you do science. Okay. I've got this model and I can use this model to make these predictions. Now, if my model is wrong, you've got to show me something that tells me why my wrong model produces these good predictions.
Right. Well, so in terms of predictions, I've heard Dr. Russell Humphreys speak of the potential rapid magnetic reversals that took place during the flood, which were predicted in advance by him. Is that one of those predictions, or a prediction of?
It is. I don't typically mention that because, in fact, that's a fairly difficult analysis to do. Okay. So what they're doing is they're looking at layers. When you just look at layers of igneous rock and you see the ores flip, that's evidence that the magnetic field flipped, and that's pretty reliable. When you now try and say how quickly that flip occurred, there are a lot of factors that go into how fast that igneous rock cooled. And so, I'm not very confident that we can say that those flips were quick. Now, in fact, in Humphrey's defense, and Humphrey's is a much better scientist than I'll ever be. In Humphrey's defense, the actual peer-reviewed evolutionary paper suggests that they're rapid flips. All right. So suggests that they're more rapid than the dynamo theory predicts. So their own assumptions lead at that. I just don't like a lot of their assumptions. So I'm not sure you can really say those are rapid flips.
Well, it's a helpful response because even with or without that one, you got the other 4 big ones.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. And so we've got a minor guy here who's asking, or his argument is this: your model predicts exponential decay from creation. Mars's magnetized crust shows it had a strong field 4 billion years ago and essentially none today. That's on/off and not exponential decay. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. J?
I guess I would disagree. It's certainly not on/off, and we don't see anything in nature that does that. Not that I can think of off the top of my, certainly nothing having to do with electricity flow. So what we know is there's none today because we've sent spacecraft out, right? And so forth. And that's maybe in the last, let's say, I don't know the history of NASA and all that, but let's say last 75 years. Last 75 years, we know that it's not there's no planetary magnetic field. The meteorite, which is by conventional dating supposed to be billions of years old, shows there was a magnetic field. But we don't have any data points in between, so we have no idea how fast the decay was. We have 2 data points. We have the data point from the meteorite, and we have the data point from, let's say, 75 years ago. That's all we have. I can fit basically any curve you want between those 2 points. He wants to go somewhere and then straight off. But we don't have the data to say that. What we have the data to say is at one time there was one, now there's not. The speed at which it happened, we have no idea because we don't have any data points in between. And even if we had data points in between, I'd have to be convinced that your time scale is right too. How are you measuring the age of those meteorites?
Right. Yeah, those are good questions. I'm glad we're on the same team, the Young Earth team, brother. Yeah, A Promise is wondering on this same topic, what were the dynamo and rapid decay theories predictions based on?
Well, it's based on the mathematics of the model. So if you actually, you can actually Google the creation of planetary magnetic fields, those words, and you'll get Humphrey's paper where he shows you exactly what his model is based on, where the calculations come from. He shows you those predictions, and this is a 1984 paper. He shows you those predictions right there in the data. So you can see for himself, it comes from the mathematics of the model. The dynamo model is significantly more complex. But once again, there's mathematics associated with how the dynamo theory thinks that this electrical current is generated. And those mathematics produce a time graph of electricity flow, which ends up we can turn into magnetic field strength. So it comes from the mathematics of the models themselves. And the models are very, very different because they start with completely different premises. So it's not surprising that their mathematics come up with completely different results.
How does what we're talking about here on the decaying magnetic field, Dr. J, how does it apply to the C14 production in the upper atmosphere in the pre-flood world versus today?
Yeah, so certainly if the magnetic field was significantly stronger, there would be less carbon-14 in the atmosphere. Because once again, we're getting carbon-14 primarily from nuclear reactions that occur based on particles that come from the sun. And the magnetic field is going to change not change the particle flux out of the sun, but change the particle flux that hits the atmosphere. So you would expect, generally speaking, if the rapid decay theory is correct, generally speaking, you would expect less carbon-14 in the atmosphere the farther back you go. For the dynamo theory, it's sinusoidal variation. It's up and down. We just happen to be on one of the down curves right now. So there they would think the carbon-14 would go up and down. So sometimes it would be more, sometimes it would be less, depending on where the magnetic field is at the time.
This kind of brings me back to something we were discussing at the beginning with the helium and zircons. I'll ask you a couple clarifying questions. If the Earth is hotter, if the surrounding rocks are hotter that we find zircon crystals in, would that mean it's hotter, so helium's escaping quicker?
Yeah, so the diffusion is temperature dependent, for sure. But you have to understand that, even if the mantle increased in temperature by, let's say, I'm not a geologist, so I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air. This is my general thermodynamics knowledge. If I increase the temperature of the mantle significantly, it's not going to increase the temperature of the crust much.
Okay.
It really isn't, because there's so much insulation that it just, so I think any kind of variation in temperature that's happening in a mineral that's in the earth is due to local effects. Like, for example, if there's a lava hot spot that flows up, then yeah, that surrounding rock's going to get hot. But I don't think any global effect is going to affect the temperature of the rocks that much. So I think I'd have to have a local history to know what to expect for diffusion. But in this study that we were talking about, we knew they know the local history. At least geologically speaking, they know roughly the local history. So the experiments they did were specifically for the conditions found in that area.
In that in the Los Alamos. Los Alamos.
Maybe I can't remember what it was called. What that site was called. I don't think it was called Los Alamos though.
Okay.
Anyway, I can't remember. But yeah, they did it for that particular and for the assumed geological history of that area.
So if deep time proponents were to say, well, the reason why we still have so much, and I don't want to misrepresent them, but if they were to say that the reason why we have so much helium still is because the variation in temperatures, it was colder in the past, so it retained more. I mean, that doesn't work though.
No, and actually, Humphreys did something many years ago when somebody brought that up, saying let's cool this down to liquid nitrogen temperature. Still doesn't solve your problem.
Wow. 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 So basically, let's give it to them.
Yeah.
And still doesn't solve the. That's good to know.
Now this is me trying to remember I'm old, and me trying to remember something I read 20 years ago. But nevertheless, yeah, he did something where he said, let's give you a ridiculously low temperature that we know we can't get to. Still doesn't fix the problem for you.
Wow. That is awesome. You got a lot of knowledge, Dr. J. And so, no, actually, you did address this one. Well, I guess to reiterate, with dendrochronology and the oldest tree, 5,000 years, how do you know how old it is without cutting it down? Were you talking about you can insert something into it and basically?
Yeah, you can take like a hollow tube that's sharp, and you could actually make a borehole all the way through the tree. And you want to go through the dead center to do this. So you go through the center of the tree. So you're making a big tunnel through the tree. And this device is made so that when you pull it out, what you've cut out is all intact inside the device. So now you have this rod of wood from the tree, and you see the rings in that rod. You don't see the whole ring, but you see each, the little piece of that ring and the little piece of the next ring. So you can count the rings just from that rod. And the beautiful thing is about a tree, and you've seen that there's this famous tree out west that you can drive through, but it's still alive, because in the end, trees, they aren't killed just by putting a hole through them, and for this tree, for any tree that we actually do this for, we actually plug up the holes to keep parasites out and things like that. So anyway, the tree's fine. And you just got this big rod of wood that you can count the rings on.
So in your opinion, at creation, do you think the original created trees would have had pre-existing rings, or?
This is a great question. I've talked at length with several of my more philosophy inclined creationist fellows. I personally don't think so. There are a couple of things that I think, because anytime there's a story to tell and you're telling about something that didn't happen, you're lying. Right. So, for example, tree rings, they give you a record of how wet a year was, how hot it was, how long the winter was, and all that. So you get a record of climate. That's what, people are worried about global warming. They've been using tree rings to try and figure out climate. Right. So you get a record of climate. Well, if the trees that were created had tree rings, they'd be telling a story about a climate that never happened.
Good point.
And as and in my view, and obviously we don't know the mind of God, but I would think that would be God lying, and he wouldn't lie. So I honestly do think if you were back in the Garden of Eden and you cut down one of the trees, it'd just be this mass of wood with no rings in it.
That's pretty cool.
Just like I think, when Christ turned water into wine, they said it was the best wine anybody had ever had. I guarantee you it tasted like no wine they had ever had, because any good enophile can tell you the story of the wine from the taste and the smell. And this wine would be so foreign to them that they wouldn't be able to tell a story from the taste and the smell, because God doesn't tell stories that aren't true.
Well, that makes sense. So then so in your opinion then, because I think what you said makes sense, the original created rocks, do you think they would have had pre-existing ratios of any kind, uranium and lead mixed in, or with any daughter isotope we find, would that be due to literal decay, or is any of it created?
Well, but see, that's the problem. We're not telling a story now because we don't really know what the original distribution is. Like, for example, the way astrophysicists think that heavy elements are made is that a supernova occurs, bunches of neutrons get released, atoms, because stars can't make any atom above iron 56 because of the energetics. Iron 56 is the most stable nucleus, so small nuclei will fuse up to iron 56, but after iron 56, nuclei fall apart rather than fuse together. So stars can make up to iron 56, but to get anything heavier, the thought is lots of neutrons come in from a supernova. They get absorbed by these iron atoms, but the huge amount of neutrons isn't stable, so that then beta decays, and beta turns those neutrons into protons, and that's how we get heavier elements. So using, if that's the way heavy elements were produced, then yes, there's a story there. But I don't think that's how heavy elements were produced. I think heavy elements were produced based on what was necessary for the universe to run properly. So in order to tell a story, I'd first have to know what's the proper mix of all of the elements to run the universe properly. And I don't know that. So I'm not sure I can infer anything.
Okay.
So I don't think that's necessarily, but I think there are certain things that tell a story. And this is why I don't think God created light on its way here.
Right, in transit, right.
Right, for the same reason, because then we'd be looking at galaxy collisions that never occurred.
Yeah.
Right. So those are the kind of things that I think are pretty much ruled out by. I'm not sure something as detailed as what you're saying with rocks can be ruled out.
Well, that's good. Okay, so I appreciate that answer. And so then back to dendrochronology and the tree rings. Are there any trees that we find that we would say are pre-flood that have too many rings to account for in the 6,000 year young Earth timeline?
Well, no, not 6,000 for sure. You could argue maybe Methuselah is pre-flood. I don't think it is, because 4,790 years is before the flood. Right. But I think that there's enough, fuzz in that data, because sometimes multiple rings form, that all you could say is the upper limit is 4,790, and if that's the upper limit, that's at least consistent still with being destroyed by the flood. So no, I don't think we certainly haven't found any trees with rings greater than 6,000. But now, once again, there are two things you can do. One is you can date them another way, like you can carbon-14 date dead trees. Or carbon-14 date, the inside of a tree, the heartwood of a tree that's dead. And you can get older trees that way, but I don't think those are legitimate dating methods. So I don't think the other thing you can do, and this is a really interesting study, and it's a neat thing you can do. Let's suppose you find a tree that's alive, and then you find a fossilized tree in roughly the same area. If you analyze them properly, you might be able to find a pattern of rings in the live tree that also appears in the fossilized tree. And if the pattern is really, really similar and long enough, you can say, hey, that's when both trees were still alive. So now I can take that fossil tree, say, okay, that pattern corresponds to this time I got from the live tree, and then I can keep counting backwards from there. So this is extending the tree ring chronology back. All right. Now, the problem, of course, not surprisingly, is it's impossible to get perfectly matched tree rings. So you have to come up with what's your criterion for saying these patterns are enough to overlap. Well, there's something called a t-value you use, and that t-value says how perfectly they match. If you don't care much about t-values, you can get tree ring chronologies that go back 20,000 years. If you care a lot about T values, then you get tree ring chronologies that go about 9,000 years back. So there are some tree ring chronologies that go about 9,000 years back that use living trees and fossilized trees and overlap those patterns. And you have to either somehow explain away why those patterns look so good, or you have to say, well, maybe the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, maybe it's 10,000 years old. That's actually why I don't say 6,000 years old.
Okay.
What I say is it's probably, and I think Sanford is the same way. We say it's under 10,000 years
Under
old.
10.
Because a lot of these tree ring chronologies go back farther than that, have really poor T values, and I have no problem saying, even if this gave me an answer I liked, I still wouldn't accept it because the T values are too low. But for some that I think have legitimate overlapping sequences, you can go back about 9,000 years.
That's interesting. So when we see old Earth creationists argue that dendrochronology contradicts the young Earth model, that's what they're looking to.
Yep.
Is
they're looking at these overlap. There's a name for it. I can't remember the name, but when you overlap live trees with dead trees, that's what they're talking about. And yes, you can go back even more than 10,000 years if you don't care about really matching the.
So a young Earth creationist who would stick strictly with that 6,000 to 7,000 years, would we have to say that you're just getting multiple rings in the same year because of ice age related conditions after the flood or something like that? Or
well, I think the thing you'd probably want to argue is these, even though statistically these tree rings seem to align really well, they don't actually indicate that the trees were living at the same time.
Okay.
That just and coincidences happen. It just by coincidence they have very similar patterns in that part of their history, but not because they were actually living at the same time.
I see what you. Okay, and so
the overlap is coincidence, not real.
Right. So, and you would like to say the overlap, the pattern, it's therefore more safe to say that, well, the Earth is under 10,000, not
because
but under 10.
Yeah, because I am pretty convinced by the patterns. I mean, I'm not a big believer in a lot of coincidences.
Yeah, right.
And when I see a large amount of pattern overlap, it's hard for me to say, well, that's just coincidence.
Yeah. Is that because the T value is really strong, basically?
Because there's a statistical way, obviously this is all done with math, but in the end, there's a statistical function you can say is how likely is it that this is coincidence?
Right.
And that the higher the T value, the more likely it is coincidence. So the lower the T value, the less likely it is for coincidence. So you're looking for low T values.
So here we got concept of why I was wondering, how do you know the carbon-14 dates for the trees are right?
Well, we know they're not. So for example, like if I take these rings and I know how old the ring is by dendrochronology, and then I carbon-14 date it. If I don't make a correction, the carbon-14 date's wrong. So the ring's 500 years old. Without a calibration, the carbon-14 date says it's 600 years old. That's the way it is. But what you're using those tree rings for is, they're old, and how much carbon-14 is in them now. They're 500 years old, so how much decayed. So you actually have a pretty good measurement of the carbon-14 level that year, 500 years ago. Once you have that, then you can use that to calibrate all your carbon-14 data. So at that point, then we have a pretty good idea. But once again, that runs out after 3,000, 3,500s.
Well, that's good. That's very helpful. And he's just clarifying. So it's overlap of tree rings.
Yeah. This isn't carbon-14 dating. This is just using tree ring counting.
Only tree.
But the idea is you can take a living tree and match it to a fossilized tree where the patterns overlap, and say, okay, when the patterns were the same, they were both alive. That allows you to then extend the tree ring chronology down, because now the fossilized tree is going to have more tree rings.
And so to be clear, that fossilized tree is from the flood, or not necessarily. It could be post-flood too.
Oh, it could be post-flood, because a lot of times because very few trees are 4,000 years old.
Right.
So even if I want to do a tree ring chronology that's just to the flood, I'm going to have to do this overlap of tree rings to take a living tree and extend, because this has to be in the same area. I can only do this if the tree and the living tree and the
on one
fossil
side of the earth and
Yeah,
compare it to
because
another one on the other.
it's a climate match. So
Right,
if I want to do a tree ring chronology for some local place, then I am, even to go back 4,000 years, I'm going to have to do that overlap.
Okay, that's interesting. That's helpful. And so we have Wesley who's wondering this. He's in light of our discussion earlier on the isotopes, he's wondering, what do you think about the idea of piezo catalytic isotope redistribution as a partial explanation of modern rock ratios?
So have you ever chewed on a mint and seen a spark?
No.
Okay. Well, one of the experiments I have my students do in one of the elementary books is, if you go to a dark room with a wintergreen lifesaver and a wrench, and you crush the wintergreen lifesaver with the wrench, you're going to see sparks.
Well, that's cool.
That's called piezoelectricity.
Okay.
Because atoms all have electrons, and if I interrupt those, if I jostle those atoms really roughly, some of those electrons are going to be liberated, and you're going to see that as a spark. So that happens everywhere. Anything that has atoms, this can happen to. So let's say we have a rock system that gets fractured due to some tectonic activity. There's going to be a lot of piezoelectricity, and it's probably going to be pretty concentrated, so it could have a lot of energy. And if it has a lot of energy, it could actually induce nuclear reactions. And those nuclear reactions then change the distribution of isotopes. And that would, of course, make it harder to do radioactive dating because of that. And so piezoelectricity is often thought of as a way of explaining how we get more of what appear to be the products of radioactive decay, when they're not really radioactive decay. They're the result of nuclear reactions produced this way. And we know it happens. I have never seen any really good evidence that gives me an idea of how much this happens. All right. Because we can do it in the lab really well, but we're not using, reasonable conditions for the natural world. So we do know this can produce nuclear reactions. We know that for sure. How common this is still an open question. I would like to see a lot more research done on this.
Is this what they did, the piezoelectric effects? Is this what they did in Ukraine with the Z-pinch experiments, where apparently they created some of these isotopes? I don't know. I've heard this.
Yeah. See, and the problem with that, I think that group is called Proton, maybe.
Proton 21 Labs.
Yeah, Proton 21 Labs. The problem is they're very closed with their data, and that always makes me a little suspicious. And I don't mean to cast aspersions at all, but if you're not going to really show me your raw data, I'm going to have to take a pass.
Hard to analyze.
Yeah, I'm going to have to take a pass. So, I hope that their results are real, and I hope they do more, but I hope they get more open about what they're doing.
So he's got a follow-up, and that was a really good response. I'm learning so much from you, Dr. J. I feel like I'm in class. I feel like I'm in a university class with a top university professor. So
I do teach at the university level, so I am a university professor.
I can tell.
Probably not a top one, though.
Well, it's been very helpful to me, so you're doing a great job. So his follow-up question is then, what do you think about this occurring in the turbidity currents during the flood?
Okay, I'm not a geologist, certainly not a hydrologist either. I'm not sure that a turbidity current can really produce this effect. I'm looking for something that's a lot more abrupt. So you think about how plate movements occur. They're not smooth, because the rocks kind of grab onto each other, and then after a while enough tension occurs that they break apart. That's what produces piezoelectricity. Like, take the wrench and crush the wintergreen, then you'll get your sparks. If you just kind of slowly break the wintergreen, you're not going to get the sparks. So in my mind, I'm not sure how currents could do that. Now, once again, I really haven't looked into that, so maybe there's a way that happens that I don't know, but I can't see how that could be violent enough to produce these kind of effects.
So would somebody have to say if piezoelectric effects are taking place to form these nuclear reactions, And so if I understand what you were saying earlier, to invoke that as young Earth creationists, we would say that some of these a lot of the radioactive decay, some of it's sure happening from, uranium to lead, so on and so forth, but also some of it just through these catastrophic effects during the flood, rapid plate movement, found a great deep break open. So it would be a mix then, which would make it, if this were true, it'd be difficult for us to put any real confidence in some of these dates that are derived.
Well, yeah. So like, for example, I think it's lead-214, but there's one particular isotope of lead that, as far as we know, only comes from radioactive decay, right? But if lead-214 can be produced by nuclear reactions induced by piezoelectric effects, then suddenly we have another way of making lead-214. So now not all of the lead-214 has come from radioactive decay. So now we have to limit how much radioactive decay actually occurred, because we know at least some of it came from another process. I think that's where creationists go with that. The idea that, there are some isotopes that really should only come from radioactive decay, but if we could produce it another way, that would get rid of the need for all this radioactive decay, get rid of the need for all this heat that we're worried about and all of that. So that could be nice. And I think that's a fruitful line of research. I just don't think it's gone very far.
But would that also have to explain the general pattern that we see, where the lower rocks date older than the rocks? And I understand from a CPT perspective, more hits accelerated decay basically early on in the flood versus later on would explain that pattern. But I saw you're going to say something. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not quite that simple, because I agree there is a general pattern that Precambrian rock is below Cretaceous rock, for example. But there's also been a lot of uplift and change and a lot of erosion and so forth. So I'm not sure how strong the pattern is that if you go deeper, you get more radioactive decay. I agree that if you go to if you order the layers and you say, okay, here's all the stuff that's in Precambrian rock, here's all the stuff that's in Cambrian rock, here's all the stuff that's in the next level, those generally form the pattern you're looking at. I'm not sure if that's exactly a depth pattern, though. But once again, that'd be a Dr. Snelling question.
Yeah. Well, I remember I remember Dr. Snelling correlating it with fission tracks in the geologic column.
Yes, and I think that's really good research that he's doing there.
Yeah. Well, as we start to wind down, this has been so good. We'll wrap it up with one last question, and I already look forward to hopefully having you back on in the future, Dr. J, because I could ask you questions until same time tomorrow, brother. So Lynn Mitzi is wondering, I heard the oldest Earth rock was found on the moon. How do you say it got there? Are you familiar with that?
I am not familiar with that, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I can't even surprise me that it's the oldest. I mean, that would surprise me. But Earth rocks on the moon, I don't have a problem with, because we have a lot of catastrophic events on Earth that produce an enormous amount of projectiles coming off the Earth. And the moon is close enough that it's got a pretty strong gravitational field. So if I can get a rock high enough, then it could be captured by the moon. And so now we just need to have a rock that's launched by, and you can imagine even just a volcano that gets plugged up for a while. An enormous amount of pressure ensues, and then suddenly that pressure finally releases. I can easily imagine that gives the rock enough escape velocity to get out of where Earth's gravitational field dominates and gets into where the moon's gravitational field dominates. Yeah, and especially if the moon happens to be in that general vicinity.
Right.
If the volcano kind of is aimed at the moon at that time, then that's even increases. And then this is the problem. Like, for example, let's suppose we get a Mars sample, either one of the rovers finds it and analyzes it, or we get it sent back somehow, and it's got bacteria in it. There's a real question about whether those bacteria came from Earth. Because in the end, these projectiles, the ejectiles, they go everywhere. And some of them have bacterial spores on them. And those spores are remarkably hardy. And so it is not at all beyond the realm of possibility that an ejectile has some bacterial spores, ends up getting caught by Mars. And then on Mars, it finds some sort of environment that's enough to at least germinate again.
That's interesting.
So yeah, there's it's not something you see because these are all pretty small things.
Right.
But nevertheless, I mean, if you've ever watched some video of some of these really catastrophic volcanic eruptions, there's an enormous amount of energy there.
So yeah, it's a good point.
Enough to launch a
scary amount of energy.
Yeah.
So is it true that they essentially dated the Earth 4.6, 4.8, whatever billion years they dated it based on a meteorite rather than the Earth itself?
Yeah, but well, the idea is when the Earth first formed in the evolutionary model, it's all molten. And so you're not going to get any kind of good isotopic signature because they're all moving around in this molten sphere-ish thing, so I can't do radioactive dating really until we have solid material, right? And so at that point, so that's supposedly a few 100 million years in to Earth's history.
Okay.
So yeah, we date the Earth radioactively by not necessarily meteorites, but by things in the solar system. By space debris in the solar system that's supposed to be a part of the original accretion disk. But the thing is, this is the crazy thing, and nobody knows this because nobody cares. But in fact, the oldest rock ever, the oldest thing ever dated on Earth is dated at 5.6 plus or minus 0.1 billion years old.
That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that nobody talks
older
about
than they
that?
say.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. And the thing is, it's 5.6 plus or minus 0.1. Now I might have the numbers wrong. It's like, but it's on my blog. But let's suppose it's 5.6 plus or minus 0.1. Well, even if you're an evolutionist, it's not plus or minus 0.1. It's going to be at least minus 1.1, right?
Right.
Right. But no, they say it's plus or minus 0.1. That's the craziness about radioactive decay. And obviously we just throw that number away. There's no reason to throw it away. In fact, there's a thing you can do called the isochron plot that kind of helps you have faith in that. It has a perfect isochron plot. It has a textbook isochron plot, but it dates older than the Earth can be. And therefore it's simply ignored.
So then they have to take that isochron plot and discard it.
Yep,
even
they just
though
say
it's perfect.
Yeah,
it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, and there was a follow-up paper written later giving some possible explanations of why it could be a perfect isochron plot, but not be real date. But my response to that is, how do you know all those other perfect isochron plots don't have that same issue?
Right.
Right. No, and but this happens a lot in evolution. If it fits the model, we believe it. If it doesn't fit the model, we don't. So why is it that human forearms and other mammal forearms look so similar? Because of evolution, because they're closely related. Why is it that human eyes look like octopus eyes? Oh, not because they're closely related.
Convergent evolution.
Yeah. So when it fits the model, we take it. When it doesn't fit the model, we explain around it.
Right. Homology when it fits. Homoplazy when it doesn't fit.
Exactly.
Or convergent evolution.
That happens throughout. And the older you believe the Earth is, the more you have to do that.
Wow. It's just like a commenter here said, Examining Origins, who also runs a podcast, says, wow. So I see all the time, we host a lot of debates here at Creation Evolution, and the evolutionists, the more informed evolutionists, they'll counter the creationists, us as creationists, when we point to the discordant dates that we find, for example, some of the work that Dr. Steve Austin has done with Mount St. Helens and so on. Excellent work. And they'll point to the isochron dating. They'll say, well, this removes the assumptions. And if we get that straight line on the graph, but what you're saying is you can actually get a straight line. You can get a good isochron plot, and yet it's rejected, a perfect plot, and yet it's rejected for whatever reason.
Well, because it's data we can't accept for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't talk about this in my talk, but one of the things that turned me away from believing in an old Earth, I was always skeptical of it. But it's when I started watching the folks who were doing radioactive dating in my lab. The way this works is you can just look at the screen, and you don't know the numbers, but you know relative age just based on what you see on the screen. And so there'd be a bunch of dots, and they'd take a circle, make a circle around. Okay, that's the ones we're going to use for the age. And you ask them, why aren't you going to use that dot or that dot? Well, this is Cretaceous rock, so it can't be 2 million years old, and it can't be 500 million years old. So we're just going to ignore those dates. Wow. It's like, that's, if that's science, it's not very accurate science. let's say. And so that's the first thing that made me think, wow, this isn't nearly as reliable as everybody seems to think it is.
Well, yeah, well, it makes me wonder, okay, well, why should we trust all the other isochron dates that we get then? If a perfect line or correlation is actually a false date, then why should we believe, especially with, and as Creationists like to ask the question, if we can't get accurate dates from rocks of known age, like known volcanic eruptions, why should we trust the dates derived from rocks of unknown age, where we didn't actually see that, volcanic eruption and those layers formed? I think that's a pretty good question, isn't it, Dr. J?
Yeah, well, yeah, and the typical evolutionist answer is, okay, we know this lava flow occurred 400 years ago, but potassium argon dating says it's 2.5 million years old. But potassium argon dating is only for old things. You can't use it for
what they say, right?
Right. But then my question is, well, how do you know that any of the things you're dating aren't young? Well, it's not because of the result of potassium argon date, because you've already rejected it here. Mm-hmm. So that's the problem. It really goes. I've always said this, and a lot of people have taken issue with it, but honestly, if I had to believe in either an old Earth or evolution in the grand scale from total common ancestry, I think there's more evidence for total common ancestry than there is for an old Earth. I really do. That's because the old Earth data is so contradictory and so difficult to interpret. I at least think that if you can ignore certain uneasy things, you can believe in evolution as a creation story. It's easier scientifically, in my opinion, to believe that. I think the old Earth is just so full of discordant, but for some odd reason, and maybe it's just I'm crazy, but for some odd reason, the vast majority of scientists see it the other way. They think we have a number for the age of the Earth, but they're willing to question whether evolution in the grand scheme happened.
Well, that's interesting you said that, because I've seen many, including professional old Earth creation scientists, say the only reason us young Earth creationists even believe in a young Earth is not because of the science, it's because of the Bible, and obviously God's word's the final word and our final authority. But they're basically saying without the Bible, we would never be young Earth creationists based on the science, because there's just no scientific evidence. And seems like you're saying something different.
No, it's, obviously I can't make the statement because the Bible does exist.
Right.
But,
yeah.
So right now, even if I just say suddenly denounce my faith in Christ, I still wouldn't believe in an ancient Earth. Just from a scientific standpoint, I just couldn't. What I think what the Bible does, and this is what I believe, the Bible allows you to be open-minded. If you can't believe there's a supernatural creator, then you have to believe in some naturalistic process, probably evolution, and therefore you're required to believe in billions of years.
Right.
If you at least have the option that this could be all supernaturally started, then in the end, it could have been supernaturally started 4.6 billion years ago, or it could have been supernaturally started 6,000 years ago. But now at least you have the option to choose both. So, as much as I think Answers in Genesis and those guys have done wonderful things, I think from a scientific point of view, their statements are flawed because they cannot give up the age of the Earth being young. Naturalistic evolutionists, their view on the age of the Earth is just as flawed because they can't give up it being billions of years old. If you have someone who has the ability to be open-minded about this, and honestly, I could be a C.S. Lewis type of Christian. I mean, far be it for me to say C.S. Lewis is not going to heaven, right? But he believed in evolution. He said that evolution was the way the brain formed, but not the way the mind formed. So he'd be basically a theistic evolutionist today. He might be more of a Behe theistic evolutionist, where by Behe thinks the first cell that was created front loaded all the information and then it just happened. So he might be like that, but he would follow the standard theistic evolution line. And so I could probably be a theistic evolutionist without an issue. I was for a while, not a theistic evolutionist. I was an old Earth creationist. even before I was a Christian, I had problems with evolution. So even when I wasn't a Christian, I wanted an evolutionist, because that even at an early age, that was really stupid. But you know, so in the end, I think I don't need to believe in an old Earth for my theology. I think it makes my theology easier,
Yes.
but it doesn't make it impossible. So no, I disagree with that. At least for me, it's not the Bible forcing me there.
Well, that's a good clickbait moment. That's a good clip-worthy moment, because that kind of shuts down the critics that assert that no young Earth creationist science, no qualified science would ever believe in a young Earth if it wasn't for the Bible. And you've pointed out why the evidence is actually so contradictory to an old Earth that if you had to pick one,
yeah,
probably
with or without the
common
Bible,
over...
yeah, with or without the Bible right now, I'd still pick young Earth. I'd have to, because from a scientific point of view, I just don't see how anybody can be a open-minded science, or an unbiased scientist, and believe in an old Earth. There's just too much wrong with it.
That's great. And you made a good point too, that if you reject the Bible, you reject the supernatural, but yet you want to accept you want to believe, capital B, in common descent. Well, then what comes with it is basically the old Earth, because you can't take fish to fishermen or single-celled like organisms into whales, humans, chimpanzees in 6,000 years or 10,000. I mean, you need millions to billions of years for that. So it's essentially required. They need a lot of time.
Yeah, so I think both sides of the argument is mostly filled with biased people, and there are some unbiased people in the middle.
Yeah, it sounds like you're falling kind of in the middle, where you're allowing
I feel like I am
to guide you wherever it goes, or wherever it takes you. Wow, that's some excellent information. Dr. J, has been an extremely edifying discussion. The audience has had a great time. We've had a lot of really good audience interaction, good mix as well, brother, of critics and non-critics. I think we covered a lot. We've covered quite a bit tonight, and hopefully we can have you back on for another podcast in the future, as it's been a true blessing and privilege to be able to discuss this topic, Dr. J. So what I'd like to do is hand it to you in case there's any final words, final thoughts, essentially anything you want to leave us with here tonight.
Yeah, I guess my final thought would be fundamentally, Christianity and science work together. And if you look through the history of science, it was like that. The scientific method comes to us from Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon. And the reason they developed the scientific method, hypothesize, experiment, and so forth, the reason they developed that was try to get rid of the sin effect on our brain, on our mind. Because in the end, when you're only doing philosophy, you're only using your mind. And Robert Grosseteste says your mind is corrupted by sin. You've got to be turned to the light. Roger Bacon said the way you do that is you do experiments, because experiments utilize your external senses, which includes light. So Christianity and science work together. We don't all have to be on the same page as Christians when it comes to science, because we never have been. There has never been a consensus in the church throughout the history of the Christian faith about anything related to scientific principles or even creation. The only constant is God created. So we don't have to be on the same page at all. But what we should do is we should do science honestly. All of us, regardless of where you are. And this is true of atheists as well, although, as Roger Bacon himself said, you can't really be a good scientist if you're not a Christian. Even if you're no matter what you're doing, you need to do the science honestly. And if you do the science honestly, you're going to at least land closer to the truth than if you're doing the science dishonestly to preserve some of your preconceived notions.
Well, those are great and valuable final words. We don't have to all be on the same page as Christians. Clearly, there's theological differences. There's even, in-house differences, I like to call them. But even within the way we view and argue for a young Earth, there's difference. There's different models with the flood, different, viewpoints within those models. But we need to, when it comes to science, we need to do the science faithfully and honestly. And I like the way you put it at the end there, which means as a result, we'll come as close to the truth as possible. Isn't that right?
Yep.
Dr. J, excellent program. I really enjoyed this. Time flew by with you. I've learned a lot. And so excellent job. I appreciate your time, Dr. J. To those in the audience, thank you so much for the enthusiasm, the passion, the questions, the challenges, and the support. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. God bless you all. Standing for Truth is signing off.